In the classical Western dramatic structure, every story starts with an exposition, the portion dedicated to setting up characters, rules, and so on without actually moving the plot forward. In modern AAA computer games, this is almost always the case, and generally, as time goes on, you see more and more games extend the time you spend in this phase. On one hand, a mainstream game has to have this to some degree. Publishers expect games to be accessible to everyone, and developers would surely be disappointed if their finely crafted worlds weren't introduced thoroughly. For the player, on the other hand, this can quickly become irksome. Some games have you playing for hours, up to 15 or 20 in extreme cases, before anything significant really happens, especially in the larger open world games that dominate mainstream gaming today. Many still remember the 80s and 90s, when the exposition phase was almost non-existent due to hardware limitations. Thus, a complaint you'll often hear from that demographic is that games these days just take too long to get started. But that begs the question, what is too long? At what point does the exposition phase become a waste of time? That's why in today's Gemini report, I'll either be talking about the best and worst toilet cleaning supplies, or this topic. I won't bet on the former. How long an introduction should take varies depending on who you ask. Most of the universally loved introductions successfully establish the characters and rules in about 10 or so minutes. Part of the reason why audiences loved Jaws and Star Wars back in the day was because of how they established the main threat with subtle camera techniques as opposed to words. Computer games have a tougher job as they need to establish their mechanics as well, but they're certainly up to the task. Final Fantasy VII grabbed players through the bombing mission, which weaved in details about the conflict and the game mechanics naturally. Also helping it was an impressive FMV sequence which demonstrated the scope of the game using a high-angle shot of the city of Midgar. These days though, titles such as the Assassin's Creed games dedicate 15 to 20 hours to providing the same information, not because there are more complex mechanics to explain, but rather the player needs to perform repetitive fetch quests for NPCs. I've definitely been in these trenches before when I played Xenoblade X. The game spent its first 3 chapters throwing tutorials at me, then making me complete a quota of fetch quests before I can learn about the central conflict, and most of the finer aspects of combat. It's easy to criticise intros of this length as they cause the narrative to lack momentum. They also falter from a gameplay standpoint, as the player will never end up learning about more advanced mechanics if they're just picking up items. If the developer isn't careful, the audience will just drop the title if they don't have the time and patience to stick with it. It's not as if these longer introductions are necessarily bad, though. Metroid Prime is an example I can think of that's able to strike a perfect balance. The opening at the frigate gave the player a tense scenario to kick the game off with, but they have to spend time in the Chozo ruins to gather their equipment back afterwards. Rather than performing any first-person action, the player has to scavenge for clues about the planet and solve puzzles to earn their items back. In my opinion, though, this helped the game out as it allowed the player to take in the atmosphere of Talon 4 and learn of the most efficient routes to take. With this case now, you definitely can't say it wastes the player's time as they'll be getting to grips with their surroundings and gradually picking up their arsenal. Can you honestly say the same for the early game grinds in these open world games? Well, going back to my Xenoblade X example, the side quests are effective at building the world as the player can relate to the struggles that the bit players endure and explore whatever areas are required to solve their problems. However, gameplay wise you're still not exactly doing anything worthwhile outside of collecting items and fighting monsters with the same techniques you learnt in the first 3 chapters. Therefore, unless more doors are open to the player for completing these quests, then the developer is wasting the audience's time if they're forced to go through them to progress with the narrative. Now for the final point, how does one strike a balance? The examples are listed at the start perfectly balance introducing the conflict and keeping the audience at the edge of their seat. With these open world games though, there are several more exciting activities than picking up items for people. But what if developers spent several man-hours towards designing these quests? Somehow. Well, a simple yet effective method to achieving this balance is making these quests optional. The first Xenoblade and Final Fantasy XII accomplished this perfectly, starting off with a thrilling action scene, and then the player can relax and learn about the game's world at their own pace. Now, even if games aren't padded out with these fetch quests, they can suffer from a curse known as the unskippable cutscene. Several Nintendo games are plagued by this trope. Super Mario Sunshine being a notorious case. The audience plays a Mario game for the platforming, not to learn about a piece of kit that only involves a few buttons and to see a fat Italian give Disney eyes behind a prison cell. Say what you want about 3D World in comparison to the previous games. While the cutscene was unskippable, at least it was short and the game never crammed tutorials down your throat. Ultimately, I believe the best way of achieving a balance is to introduce the rules to the player through whatever means they see fit, but they don't have to view this information on repeated playthroughs, and they should be given something meaningful to do during this exposition period, preferably involving the game's mechanics. For these longer games, I'm sure that designers are capable of letting the players pass through these sequences in about 2 hours tops. If more developers follow this example, then less players will feel cynical about the gaming industry. What do you think of slow-paced introductions? Do you have the patience to persevere? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, if I've made any errors, post me with any corrections. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other content covering characters such as Waluigi and gaming topics like backwards compatibility. Also, we've started up a podcast with Macropa and Kaiser Anoni to tide the channel over until the main uploads are posted. Give them a watch if you want something more light-hearted. Thank you for your time.